Okay, so for the last topic of the last week of the last unit of Science 20, the big ideas. What are homologous structures? What are analogous structures? What are vestigial structures? How do all of those structures from 1 to 3, the ones we just said, provide evidence for evolution? How do DNA sequences provide evidence for evolution? How does embryology provide evidence for evolution? What was Lamarck's theory of evolution by acquired characteristics, and does Lamarck's theory make any sense? So be on the lookout for those as we go. So as you may have guessed from the big ideas, today we're looking at some of the evidence for evolution. Because the theory does make sense based on what we talked about yesterday. You can see, okay, I see how that could lead to changes in populations, but just it making sense and you seeing how it could work isn't good enough for science, right? We need some evidence. And there is a ton of evidence. Okay, we're just going to look at a few today, but there's books and books and books and books full of evidence that evolution is occurring and has been occurring for millions of years. Okay, so through various methods that have to do with, well, looking at the fossil record, looking at current things, comparing the anatomy of organisms, we can kind of construct what we call a tree of life, okay, which just basically traces the evolutionary history of different species. Essentially, think of it like a family tree, but not just for your family and not even just for humans, for everything that's alive, okay? Now, just like in a family tree, the more closely you're related, the less far back you have to go to find a common ancestor, right? So to use a family tree again, to find your common ancestor with your sister, you only have to go back one step, right, to your parents. But to find a common ancestor to your cousins, well, now you have to go back two steps because you have to go back to your grandparents, right? If you want to find a common ancestor with your 17th cousin 4 times removed, you're probably going to have to go back pretty far. And if you want to find your common ancestor to someone who's not even related to you, you might have to go back super far, like back to some guy that lived in another continent 1,000 years ago or something, right? So the same idea applies to life. So it's just a common ancestor is just a species from which two separate species can trace their evolutionary origins, right? So your grandpa is your common ancestor with your cousin because you can both trace back to your parents, and then your parents can both be traced back to your grandparents. So horses and zebras, you can kind of tell by looking at them that I bet they're pretty closely related. And they are. You can both trace them back to a common horse-like ancestor. And so there's some species that if you go back, eventually branched off into two different species, which might have branched off into more and more species, but eventually it resulted in a horse and a zebra. Now, something that's important that people often don't understand about evolution, but species do not arise because they are becoming more evolved than their ancestors. So you often hear people say, well, if humans evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Humans didn't evolve from monkeys. Humans and certain types of monkeys, especially chimpanzees, those are our closest living relatives. We just have a common ancestor. Chimpanzees are not our parents or our grandparents. They're our cousins. We did not evolve from one another. We just have a common ancestor that's not that far back. So it's not like we are more evolved versions of chimpanzees. We evolved to a different environment, a different set of things where a different set of environmental factors made different traits more beneficial, right? Chimpanzees are very well evolved for their environment. We are very well evolved for our environment. Snails are very well evolved for their environment and their role in an ecosystem. Nobody's more evolved than anybody else. You're just evolved to different roles within ecosystems. So different environmental conditions and random genetic mutations simply lead to the branching of different species from some common origin. So here is that tree of life I was talking about. And you can see this is a pretty basic one. Look, it stops at animals. It doesn't even go into reptiles, birds, right? Let alone into species. And so, yeah, you're reading this right. All life on Earth has some one common ancestor. Pretty mind-blowing to think about. You and bacteria, if you go back far enough, and we're talking far enough like back to the very, very, very beginnings of life on Earth, but technically, yes, you and bacteria have a common ancestor. It's just ridiculously far back, right? So you can see animals are most closely related to fungi. That's actually the closest related thing to all animals is fungi. Okay, of course, other animals are more closely related to us, okay, than plants, but you can kind of see the idea here, right? So the further back you have to go, the less closely related you are to something. So our most distant relatives are bacteria. We have to go very far back to get a common ancestor with them. We're pretty closely related to fungi. If we were to branch this off into different types of animals, our next kind of closest family members would be mammals, right? And then it would be primates. And then within primates, the closest species related to us is a chimpanzee, the one that's still alive anyway. Okay, so this kind of just takes that question we were talking about earlier. It says, Deniers of evolution often ask what I just said, right? If humans evolved from apes, why do apes still exist? But they're misunderstanding how evolution works. Humans did not evolve from apes, okay? Apes and humans both evolved from some other common ancestor that looked different from humans and apes. And a different set of environmental conditions made different traits beneficial. And so we went down different pathways as we evolved. All right. So, what is some of the evidence for evolution? So, one of the big ones we're going to look at is comparative anatomy. Anatomy means body structure, basically, and comparative means, well, comparing. So, just comparing the structures and traits of organisms, both living and long gone in the fossil record. The first type of comparative anatomy we're going to look at is something called homologous structures. So homo means the same, right? What does the same mean here in homo? It means same ancestor, common origin. These are structures that we got from some common ancestor, but have since evolved now to have a different use. Okay, so homologous, same origin, different use nowadays. And it really strongly suggests that the species evolved from some common ancestor that also had that structure after it had already developed. And then we took it and went and did our own thing, and it ended up evolving to suit our purposes for it. But since it had already evolved, it just said, okay, well, we'll take what we've got and we'll make it work, right? So a very strong example of this, human arms, cat arms, whale fins, and bat wings, and many other mammals too. That's just 4 examples there, okay? They have the same number and arrangement of bones. So what this suggests is something had a structure with that number and arrangement of bones. We don't know what it used it for, but it had those already. And through different environmental things, that species kind of got separated out and it speciated. And different environmental factors made different versions of that limb beneficial, right? So in some environments, that ancestor found itself needing to grab things more, right? And so when a mutation occurred that made that happen, it started, maybe speciation started to occur towards looking like a human arm that could grab. But in other environments, that ancestor may have benefited more from being fast and having claws. And so mutations that lent itself to that started to express itself. You got a cat. And then maybe some of them were in a watery environment. And so mutations that made that limb longer and flatter and able to push water became beneficial. And over enough time, it speciated into a whale, right? And then you get the same idea with a bat. So it would be a ridiculous coincidence if all 4 of us just happen to have the exact same number of bones in the exact same arrangement, just shaped differently for the different purposes we need them for, right? What makes a lot more sense is that we all had a common ancestor way, way, way back with some limb that through different environmental pressures ended up evolving differently based on the needs of its role within an ecosystem. Fast forward a couple billion years and you've got humans, cats, whales, and bats. Okay, humans, cats, whales, and bats are all mammals. We could find their common ancestor on an evolutionary tree. If we wanted to find the common ancestor that alligators, and reptiles, share with all of these species, predict whether we would have to go back further or not as far in the tree of evolutionary history. Okay, so let's think about that for a sec. Mammals, we're all kind of in the same, well, class. Mammals is a class. So we're relatively close to them, right? We are definitely closer together as mammals than we are to any reptiles. That's a different class, okay? So this is like saying, okay, if you wanted to find you and your cousin's common ancestor, how far back would you have to go? Versus if you want to find you and your cousins and your second cousins, so the ancestor that all of you share, how far back would you have to go? Well, you'd have to go back further, right? So mammals and reptiles are all vertebrates. So there's some ancestor that all vertebrates share. So we could just go find that guy. But that's going to be further back than the common ancestor that just mammals share. So okay, analogous structures. So analogous structures show that they're not that closely related. So these are structures that serve the same function but have a different evolutionary origin. So why does it show they're not as clear together? Well, it suggests that they evolved separately and then developed that kind of feature separately. Their common ancestor didn't already have it. So remember in the last example, our common ancestor already had some limb. We all evolved from that. And then evolution turned the limb into what each species needed it for most, right, over millions of years. In this case, the common ancestor that these guys share is way farther back and it doesn't have that thing. So the example that they give here is a bird wing and a butterfly wing, right? The wings of birds, bats, and insects are analogous, which means they do the same thing, but they do not indicate a common ancestor. Okay, so there is a common ancestor. It's just really far back, and it didn't have anything to do with the wing, right? So whatever common ancestor they shared obviously didn't have a wing. They split off into different species, and then millions of years later, through separate reasons, they ended up evolving wings. They didn't take some structure that already existed and turn it into their purposes. They had to kind of evolve this new structure separately from each other. The next one, these are really cool, vestigial structures, okay? A vestige means like a relic of the past. So like it's almost like a ghost from your past. It's something that's there. It's something that's there and just kind of serves to remind us of what used to be, okay? So they are structures that have no apparent use or function. But you got to remember, why would we have them if they have no apparent use or function? Well, they imply that the organism's ancestors had a more useful version of that body part. Okay, just like all evolution, environmental changes occur, and it made these structures not as beneficial for survival. In other words, we didn't really need to use them as much. But if we don't need to use them as much, but they're still part of our bodies, that means we're wasting energy on having them, right? So natural selection obviously is no longer going to favor the presence of the structure. And it would actually be beneficial to just get rid of it and avoid wasting energy on its use. But as we know, right, evolution can take a very long time. So if you fast forward far enough, yes, maybe that structure will be completely gone. But a lot of them, we're kind of catching it in the middle phase where it's still there, but it's not just going to disappear over a few generations, okay? We have tons of vestigial structures. I'll show you a video here in a sec that goes through some of them, okay? But one off the top of my head is wisdom teeth. So ever notice how all your wisdom teeth do is come in and hurt and you have to get them taken out? Yeah, they're a vestigial structure. If humans were still in the process of natural selection, which we're kind of not, right? Because we don't have to compete for resources that much. Most of our offspring survive to reproduce. But you might see in a few thousand or million years, humans start to be born without wisdom teeth. They were in the process of kind of getting evolved out. Our ancestors used to need them because they were very useful for chewing all the raw plants that we used to eat, right? Now we don't eat that many raw plants. We don't need them that much. They're not that important for our survival. So they are vestigial structures. So it still exists, but it's just kind of a ghost of a past time. It's a vestige of a time when ancestors still made use of it. So it's very strong evidence that evolution is occurring, right? If species morphology is changing, that's evolution. That's the definition of it, right? An example you can see too, they're kind of creepy. A lot of fishes that have moved into caves that have then been cut off from leaving the cave for whatever reason, but continue to survive there because there's food and stuff, right? They have vestigial, non-functional eyes. So when their ancestors first immigrated to the caves, well, it's dark in a cave. There's no reason to be able to see. An eye actually uses a lot of energy. It's a very complex organ. So if you're not using your eye, it's just wasting energy. So a mutation that makes your eyes less useful is actually beneficial because it saves you energy. So you're more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce. But again, you can imagine it doesn't just take one generation of a mutation where someone's eyes are less useful and suddenly we have no eyes now, right? It takes generations and generations and generations. There wasn't just one polar bear with slightly lighter hair. Then, okay, there we go. All polar bears are white now, right? It takes generations and generations. The change you see takes a parent growing up and having a baby, right? So they're in the process of getting rid of these eyes, but we're kind of catching it in the middle of it happening. So it's kind of creepy looking. They still have eyes, but they've evolved to the point now where they don't actually function. So you can kind of see them there, right? Those are eyes, but they can't see anything, right? So they're saving energy by not wasting energy on using their eyes. And so they can outcompete fish with sight. Show you a video about human vestigial structures.
Your body is a temple, but it's also a museum of natural history. Look closely and you'll see parts that aren't there because you need them, but because your animal ancestors did. No longer serving their previous function, but not costly enough to have disappeared, these remnants of our deep history only make sense within the framework of evolution by natural selection. With your arm on a flat surface, push your thumb against your pinky and tip your hand slightly up. If you see a raised band in the middle of your wrist, you've got a vestigial muscle in your forearm. That tendon you see connects to the palmaris longus, a muscle that around 10 to 15% of people are missing on one or both of their arms. It doesn't make them any weaker though. There's no difference in grip strength. In fact, it's one of the first tendons that surgeons will take out so that they can use it in reconstructive and cosmetic surgeries. You can find the palmaris longus across mammal species, but it's most developed among those that use their forelimbs to move around. In primates, that means the muscle is longer in lemurs and monkeys and shorter in chimps, gorillas, and other apes that don't do a lot of scrambling through trees. It's not the only leftover muscle that we've got. Look at the 3 that are attached to our outer ear. We can't get much movement out of these muscles, especially compared to some of our mammal relatives who use them to locate the sources of sounds. Presumably, this would have been quite helpful for early nocturnal mammals. In humans, you can still detect the remnants of this adaptation with electrodes. In one study, researchers recorded a spike of activity in the ear muscle cells in response to a sudden sound. Not enough to move the ear, but detectable. And you can probably guess the location of the sound based on these results. It came from a speaker placed to the left of the study subjects. So this is their left ear subconsciously trying and failing to pivot toward the sound. You can see another futile effort by our vestigial body parts when you get goosebumps. When we're cold, tiny muscles attached to our body hairs contract, pulling the hair upright, which causes the surrounding skin to form a bump. For our furry mammal relatives, the raised hair increases the amount of space for insulation, helping them stay warm. Birds can do this too. You've probably seen a puffy pigeon on a cold day. Adrenaline is one of the hormones involved in the body's response to cold temperatures, and it's also part of the fight or flight response. So it helps some animals appear larger when they're threatened. And it may be why surprising and emotional turns in music can give some people goosebumps. And then there's our tail. At the end of our spine are a set of fused vertebrae. Some people have 3, some people have 5. We call it the tailbone. It now serves as an anchor for some pelvic muscles, but it's also what's left of our ancestors' tails. Every one of us actually had a tail at one point when the basic body plan is being laid out at around 4 weeks of gestation. Human embryos closely resemble embryos of other vertebrates, and that includes a tail with 10 to 12 developing vertebrae. In many other animals, it continues to develop into a proper tail, but in humans and other apes, the cells in the tail are programmed to die a few weeks after they appear. Very rarely, though, a mutation allows the ancestral blueprint to prevail, and a human baby will be born with a true vestigial tail. The most adorable vestigial behavior is the palmar grasp reflex, where infants up until they're about 6 months old have this incredible grasp on whatever you put in their hand. There's a similar reflex for their feet. I wanted to show you this great piece of footage from the 1930s where they demonstrated this behavior. These babies are only 1 month old, and you can see that their inner monkey can support their entire weight.
Okay, biochemistry, another piece of evidence for evolution, okay? So remember that an organism's genetic information is just derived from a DNA sequence coding for different traits, right? There's a code that says have blue eyes. There's a code that says has blonde hair. And so some DNA sequences are found kind of in all organisms, and they're used by species to code for proteins fundamental for life. So essentially everything has to make certain stuff. But as speciation occurs, which again is just species branching off, okay, organisms start to make their own DNA sequences that are unique to them for certain things that they need, right? So we all have the DNA that codes for certain mandatory life functions like building cells, right? We all need to have that DNA. But we don't all need to have the DNA that gives us a hair color, because not all of us have hair, right? So the more that you've separated from something, the more different kind of things there will be in your DNA that tell you stuff based on your species and what your species has evolved to have, right? So the more similar two species DNA sequences are, the more closely they are probably related. So you can see here, a fly and a mouse. You wouldn't think a fly and a mouse, they probably don't have that much in common. But remember, they are both animals, right? Which actually puts them in the grand scheme of all life, including plants and fungi and bacteria, they're decently close together, right? They're closer together than a mouse and a potato. And so they have 76.66% similar DNA. They're both animals, so they share a lot of DNA in common. Humans and chimpanzees, you know how closely related we are? We share 99% of our DNA. If you look at the DNA of a chimp and the DNA of a human, the differences in protein codes are only 1% different. So we are very closely related. We could find a common ancestor not super far back. And when I say not super far back, I mean you would only have to go back maybe 1 million years or so, okay? So do not think this is happening overnight. When the first humans evolved, we were already way past whatever common ancestor us and chimps share. It's just that we're closer to them than we are to anyone else. Evolution is a long process. Okay, the next kind of comparative anatomy we can do is called embryology. This is very strong evidence again for evolution. So vertebrates, those are anything with a backbone. So there's basically birds, mammals, and reptiles, right? So look at the embryos of those four things, those four fairly closely related things, right? All vertebrates. Look how similar they all are. You can kind of tell that it's very likely we share a common ancestor that developed similar to this. You say human. I don't know if it's a man. Okay. So just more evidence for this evolutionary kind of tree of life. Okay. All right. The last thing for this, we're going to look at another explanation that someone tried to come up with for evolution. I feel bad for this guy. He was doing his best. He came up with a theory. No one really knew for sure what was right. And he said, okay, I'll shoot my shot. I'll try making a theory. And he will kind of forever be remembered as the guy that got it wrong and the guy that you teach in biology class to teach students how evolution does not work. So I feel bad for the guy. He was doing his best, and he will forever just be remembered as the guy who got it wrong. Let's see why. Okay, so he offered something called the theory of evolution, not by natural selection, but by acquired characteristics. Characteristics are features or traits, right? And acquired means you get them throughout your life. That's where things start to go wrong already. He was saying that the features acquired during the lifetime of an individual, so while it was still alive, you could pass those on to future generations. And to kind of communicate what he meant, he used giraffes. And he looked at giraffes and he said, why do giraffes have long necks? And he said, okay, well, I'm going to come up with my idea for it. And he said, well, they spend their whole lives stretching their necks to reach high vegetation. So go back to this guy here, this little short neck giraffe, and imagine his whole life he's stretching to reach trees. And by the time he goes from a baby to very old, that's a lot of time stretching your neck. And so it actually might, well, make your neck be a little bit longer. It might make it be a bit more stretched. And so Lamarck thought that, well, when that little stretch neck giraffe has babies, his babies are going to be born with a slightly longer neck. And then those babies are going to spend their entire lives stretching their necks to reach the tall trees. And so their necks are going to get even longer. And then that will be passed on to their babies. So during its lifetime, it was changing its neck and then passing that on to a baby. I cannot stress this enough. This is wrong, right? You should know this is wrong. How do you kind of already know this is wrong? Well, think about what we talked about yesterday. Genetics, right? How do you inherit something? You have to inherit the genes from your parents. You cannot change your genes. There is nothing you can really do to change the genes that you have. Okay? The only time genes have an opportunity to change and introduce some variation is between generations. Within one individual's lifetime, that's it. That's how they look. Okay? And on an even more surface level, you can think of a million reasons why Lamarck had to be wrong. Right? Changes only occur due to genetic variations, not because of any desire. So you can't just say, otherwise humans would just say, oh, I'd really like to evolve wings, and we would evolve wings, right? We could spend our whole lives flapping, and maybe that would get us to flap. No, we need a genetic mutation to arise that would give us wings that would then be beneficial, and over many generations, maybe that trait would pop up, okay? No one in their lifetime is going to start getting wings. It's going to take many generations and environmental factors. So an example, right? If you get a scar, your kid's not going to be born with that scar. You haven't changed your genetics by getting scarred, right? So this was kind of the big hole that everyone laughed at Lamarck for. They said, well, if I pierce my ears, are my kids going to come out with pierced ears? No, right? Get out of here, Lamarck. Just to kind of put this into play, August Weismann was a German experimental biologist who was investigating Lamarck's ideas. And Weismann cut off the tails of 22 successive generations of mice. And then he looked for offspring in the next generation that had shorter tails or no tails at all. And that was never the case. They were always born with full-size tails. And so that completely kind of proved Lamarck wrong, right? So why is the trait of not having a tail not passed along to the offspring? Well, we just said it, right? What causes traits to be passed from parent to offspring? Why do you kind of look like your parents? Because their DNA made you, right? And piercing your mom's ear wouldn't change her DNA, which wouldn't make you come out with a pierced ear, right? So cutting off the mice tails did not change their DNA. Not to mention it's very mean, poor mice. And so if you don't change DNA, you don't change what the offspring look like. Of course, there's no way to change DNA in an organism's life. You've got to wait for a mutation to occur or for sexual reproduction to just provide variation that way. Right, so their parents' DNA is still coding for a full tail, even though it got cut off. My DNA still says that I have full earlobes, even if I go and pierce my ears, right? Doesn't change the DNA that said you're going to have full earlobes. Okay, and the big ideas. What are homologous structures? What are analogous structures? What are vestigial structures? How do those three structures all provide evidence for evolution? How do DNA sequences provide evidence for evolution? How does embryology provide evidence for evolution? What was Lamarck's theory of evolution by acquired characteristics? And does Lamarck's theory really make any sense? Is it right? If you're looking for practice this stuff, try the topic 4 section of this week's practice assignment. And if you're feeling good about all this stuff this week, you can go ahead and do the weekly summative check-in. And that completes Science 20. Okay, congratulations, you finished the course. Good job. Wish we could have done it together in class, but hey, we had a unique experience this way. Okay, so please enjoy your summer. Okay, you've earned it, and I will hopefully see you around in September.